You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lee Miller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. In the previous episode, we talked all about how common dead bedrooms are and why they develop in the first place. But understanding this problem is only half the battle. The question that many couples are really asking is whether it's possible to get their sex life back, and if so, where they should even begin. Contrary to what many people assume, reviving a dead bedroom isn't simply about trying to have more sex. In fact, many sex therapists recommend approaches that sound surprisingly counterintuitive, like temporarily taking sex off the table, focusing on rebuilding emotional and physical connection, or rethinking what satisfying intimacy actually looks like. The goal isn't just increasing the frequency of sex, it's creating a sexual relationship that feels fulfilling to each partner. In this episode, we're talking about practical, evidence-based strategies for rebuilding intimacy, navigating desire discrepancies, communicating more effectively about sex, and what couples can do when they genuinely want to reconnect but aren't sure how to get there. If you've been dealing with a dead bedroom and things are feeling hopeless, this episode is for you. It turns out that there's a lot you can do to get things back on track. My guest is Dr. Lauren Fogle-Mercy, a licensed psychologist, AASECT certified sex therapist, and certified emotionally focused couples therapist. She specializes in sexual health and relationships and owns a private practice in Minnesota. She is the co-author of the book Desire, an inclusive guide to navigating libido differences in relationships. You can find her on Instagram and Facebook at Dr. Lauren Fogle-Mercy. This is going to be another fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. It's going to give you lots of practical information for how to deal with a dead bedroom and navigating sexual desire discrepancies. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. If you're looking to gain a broad understanding of human sexuality or refresh your knowledge, check out the next Human Sexuality Intensive at the Kinsey Institute. Participants will explore foundational concepts and recent developments across a range of topics related to human sexuality through an interdisciplinary, evidence-based lens. Topics will include sex, gender and sexuality, identity and intersectionality, sexual behavior and consent, dating and relationships, and more. This course is open to both emerging and established professionals looking to specialize their knowledge, as well as those seeking new career directions. Previous participants have come from all over the world, and those who successfully complete the program will receive a course certificate from the Kinsey Institute. The next intensives will be in May and June of this year. To learn more, visit kinseyinstitute.org or check the link in the show notes. Okay, Lauren, let's talk about practical ways of dealing with a dead bedroom. So let's say that a couple recognizes that they have a dead bedroom and they want to change that. Communication is obviously going to be the starting point, but that first conversation can feel incredibly scary because you might have one partner who is fearing rejection and the other who is worried about being blamed or shamed. So how do you recommend that couples begin talking about this in a way that creates collaboration? Like, how do you initiate conversations about a sexual problem productively?
Because this is a tender topic, we want to come to it thoughtfully. And even saying something that acknowledges that this is tender can be a way to diffuse some of the tension or what makes it so challenging, right? So saying something to start, like, I know this is hard for us to talk about, or I know this has been a painful subject for us. And saying something maybe to the effect of like, I don't want to be in a blame game when we talk about this. This is not about someone is in the wrong or broken. This is about talking about how we feel, what we'd like, and how we can, kind of partner together to address something that works a little bit better for us. So I think just coming to it with some gentleness is a good place to start.
Wouldn't it be nice if all relationship conversations could start like that? I think we would
I'm on
solve
a mission,
lot of
Justin. I'm working on it.
So we often focus on what couples should say when they're talking about sexual problems, but I'm also curious about the opposite. So are there things that you should avoid saying if you want the conversation to be productive rather than devolving into conflict? Like what are the things you shouldn't say so as not to trigger your partner?
I definitely would steer clear of diagnosing them and pathologizing them. So making it look like they are the problem or they have something wrong. And it really helps to talk from a place of self. And especially if you can go to a place of vulnerability, even if it's just dipping a toe into that because it feels really kind of hard or tentative, being able to say, here's some feelings that come up for me. There's some longings here. There's some struggle that I have. Here's the dilemma that we find ourselves in. Just naming some of what you're seeing, right? On the one hand, I'm over here, you're over here, and we're struggling with that, right? And can we talk more about that? What can we do about that? So I think, just being able to add a little bit of self, because what some people will do that tends to aggravate the situation is point the finger at the other. You never want to have sex. You always want to have sex. You are like this, you are like that. And that just automatically puts up defenses and shuts down the conversation. And so when we can speak from a place of self and saying, I've been missing this, I'm feeling stuck, I'm not sure how to talk about this, I don't know what to do, I need your help. That's going to set a very different tone and hopefully trigger less guardedness from, the get-go.
One of the biggest triggers in my own relationship is whenever my partner says, you always do this or you never do that. And, when people talk in those absolutes, it does tend to feel very blamey. And it's also just like not accurate because people are variable in terms of how they approach things. And you can always think of exceptions to the rule and so forth. And so it tends to devolve into an argument that just doesn't go anywhere productive. So, if you can strike a couple words from your relationship vocabulary, don't say you always or you never.
Absolutely. That's like the fastest way for it to devolve because the other person will automatically default to defensive and find the one time where that rule is not true. And, then the conversation is about that instead of what's the real message that you're trying to send, right? And it's usually about feelings that you're having and underlying what we call like attachment needs, right? The need to know that I'm, safe with you, connected to you, important to you, wanted by you. These are the things that are really at the core. And so if we can share more about that, I think that really helps open up the conversation.
So let's say you've initiated this conversation, but you're still stuck. You can't get past that at all, right? So a situation I often hear about is when one partner is unhappy with the sexual relationship, but the other seems content with the status quo. Maybe they're satisfied with the frequency of sex they're having, or they don't see a lack of sex as a problem at all. So what do you do when you've initiated this conversation, but only one person wants things to change, right? How do couples move forward without one partner feeling pressured to do something they don't want to do, or the other feels ignored or dismissed?
Such a tough situation and a common one too, right? And the way I talk about this is like, if one person is struggling with something, then the relationship has something to work on or to figure out, right? It doesn't have to be a mutual decision. You don't need unilateral, agreement that you both feel the same way. If somebody is hurting, then that's something that we need to talk about and work on. And we at least need a path to talk about it, right? That doesn't necessarily mean have duty sex or set aside all your desires for the rest of your life, right? It doesn't mean the extreme versions of that, but can we at least have a path to bring this up with each other, to talk about it, and to have some understanding of each other's positions, even if we don't agree with what's being said in terms of how important sex is to one person versus another. But if one person's struggling, that's a relational topic that merits discussion.
If you're at that sort of impasse, I think that's also a good time to speak to a therapist in terms of how you're specifically going to navigate that, because I think that's a much harder situation to navigate on your own when you've got that discrepancy where one person is content with the status quo and the other person really wants to change. It's possible that working with a therapist, you might find a path to resolution, but it's also possible that in some of these cases, you just might not be all that sexually compatible, right? And so sometimes the solution with the desire discrepancy, when it is very severe like that, and where one partner is content and the other isn't, sometimes the answer is maybe going your own ways and starting new relationships, right?
And I'll add that, a lot of people are afraid of that. And part of why they don't want to talk about it or why they don't want to seek out care is because there's an assumption that either they will be blamed or told that they have to make some significant change, or they'll find out that the relationship is ultimately not compatible. But I will say, at least in my experience, more often than not, the situation is workable. More often than not, we find that doesn't mean everybody's got their ideal circumstances in the mix or that everybody is getting exactly what they want. But more often than not, we find a livable place that is negotiable, navigated, worked on for everybody. It's rarer for me to come across, at least in my practice, a couple who is so incompatible that they have to break up because they have a discrepancy.
In reading research about sexless relationships, something that often comes up is, why do people stay in these relationships if they're really not content with the amount of sex that they're having or the type of sex that they're having? And what we hear a lot of people say is that my partner is actually the perfect partner in all ways, except for the lack of sex. And so that can be something where it can be very hard for somebody to want to leave the relationship over a sexual conflict or disagreement, because the relationship is otherwise perfect in all these other ways, right? So that can be going on. People sometimes also stay in these relationships because there are kids in the picture, or because their lives are just very enmeshed with their partners and so forth. And so there can be a lot of different factors and reasons in terms of why people stay despite having this particular disagreement. But I think it is reassuring to know that, as you see in your own clinical work, that more often than not, a solution here, because a lot of people in these relationships just feel totally hopeless.
Right. I think a lot of it is about, creating a more secure dynamic between them, whether that's within this sexual dynamic or in the general relationship, right? That we don't have to be alone when we're feeling some of these things, thinking some of these things, that we have a path to talk about it, and that we can reach each other in other ways as well. So one of the places that couples get really stuck is when sex is like the only place that someone feels loved and cared for and reassured. It can just put a lot of pressure then on the sexual dynamic to be a lot of things for that relationship. And so it's not wrong or bad to find reassurance and love and all of that through sex. That's absolutely fine. If it's the only way or vehicle to get that, it's going to put strain on the relationship over time. And so sometimes we're working on, the discrepancy around sex, and also just in general, how are you finding ways to connect with each other and to express love and to feel loved and to feel reassured, so that it's not just all paths lead to one thing or bust. So there's a lot of, like you said, desire is complex, the work is complex, and we're often going in different directions. But yeah, I think, a lot of people just jump to assuming that, it's just a sexual incompatibility and you're doomed and the relationship will end, when really there's a lot that we can do to make things feel more satisfying, not just within the sexual dynamic, but in the relationship as a whole.
And I think that's such an important point, that people attach a lot of different things to sex in terms of what it symbolizes or means to them or to the relationship. And so it's not just about the sex itself, it's about all the other things that go along with it. And yes, there are lots of people in relationships for whom sex is the sort of primary way that they feel loved or express love. And so when sex disappears, it can make the relationship feel very empty in a lot of ways. And so it's really important to unpack, what does sex actually mean, and what are people getting out of it in the relationship in terms of addressing this particular issue. Now, something we talked a little bit about in the last episode is how self-understanding is really important here in terms of understanding your own style of sexual desire. So, there are many people who believe that desire should simply emerge spontaneously, but research tells us that desire works differently in different people. So can you walk us through responsive desire and why understanding it can completely change the way that couples think about initiating sex, and how that understanding of your own desire style can help to create more opportunities for intimacy?
This is really foundational research. This is Rosemary Bassan's research from 2000 and the nonlinear model, which was originally designed as a model for women. And I think we've found over the years that this is something that can be true for people of any gender. The assumption and what we see in the media is that desire is just a light switch that gets flipped on out of the blue, really easy, quick, doesn't take any sort of provocation, where that is true for a lot of people. And that certainly feels that way. And that's just fine and a valid way to experience desire. There's also a whole bunch of people, we don't have exact numbers for this, but a whole bunch of people who experience something called responsive desire, which means that before they have the desire or just this like idea or wanting for sex, often there has to be some sort of stimulus that sets that up to help cultivate it. So for some people, that is more explicitly sexual stimuli, seeing like a sexy scene in a show, being touched in a way that feels really nice. It could be being in a really relaxed state and having a more embodied experience, and you're more open to, wandering into the sexual realm. So responsive desire is also an equally valid way to experience desire. And I have found that in some cases, just having that education around the different styles and how they are not wrong, not broken, but they operate differently. And then talking about ways to cultivate desire, just that alone for some people is enough to really help make a marked difference in their experience. Because then it's not just waiting around for something to happen that's not likely to happen so quickly or readily.
And it is amazing how often just a little bit of sex education can solve so many sexual problems. And, a big part of what you do as a therapist is really just giving people the sex ed that they never got before, because most people probably didn't learn about different styles of sexual desire when they got sex ed, if they even got any. But I think an important point to add to the discussion of spontaneous versus responsive desire is that for most people, I would imagine it's probably not just one or the other. I think people can experience both types of desire, and it might vary and fluctuate throughout their lives and at different points in time. Like I know for me personally, I don't tend to experience a lot of spontaneous desire when I'm under periods of very intense stress, right? And so my desire shifts to become a bit more responsive in those situations. But if I'm on vacation, hell, there could be a lot of spontaneous desire that emerges. And so, your style of desire, I think, can also be very context dependent, and it can be somewhat fluid over time and across different situations, and also in different relationships too.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why my co-author and I talk about it as sort of a state and or a trait. And it can depend. For some people, it may be very trait-like. Like they have always had spontaneous desire. It is always like that throughout their life across contexts, right? Some people, vice versa, with responsive, right? But then there's also, like you're talking about, seasons or contexts that can fluctuate. And so you can experience both at different times depending on the circumstances. And so I really like people to think about desire as the potential to be both a state or a trait. It could be something that's more, static, or something that flows over time with the, situation at hand. And so, we have all these things online, what style are you? But most things with a style have a bit more nuance than that. And so it's not always like you're just 100% this or 100% that.
And this is also where I think some self-reflection can come in handy in terms of thinking back to what are times in my life where I experienced more desire, right? And what were the specific contexts and circumstances under which that happened? And that can sort of give you some clue as to how you typically experience sexual desire. And so again, it's all about, I think, having a lot of this self-understanding so that you can figure out how you're going to approach this and how you're going to approach sex going forward. Now, when couples are trying to revive a dead bedroom, it's easy to assume that the goal should be to start having sex again as quickly as possible. But I've heard many therapists recommend something that sounds very counterintuitive, which is taking sex off the table for a while. So why would a therapist ask a couple who's already not having much sex to stop trying to have sex? What's the thinking behind that approach, and does that actually help?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? It seems very paradoxical. The thinking is that if you're doing something that's not working for you, let's sort of stop doing the thing that's not working for you and not do more of that, right? Because all that happens is, from a learning perspective, we keep pairing either a negative or unsatisfying experience with sex. And so over and over and over, you're having, whether it's pain, discomfort, disconnection, or just going through the motions, that keeps pairing those two things together, that sex goes along with some sort of, negative experience. So often I think that's where it's coming from. And what's funny, and there have been times where I've told people, like, let's put, a pause on sex as you've experienced it and as you know it. And sometimes that's just because we want to sort of stop the bleeding, so to speak, so that we don't just keep doing the same thing over and over. And so that we can actually put something in its place and make some changes. So I think that's where that recommendation comes in. And then that gets us to slow down and really look at what we want to actually reinforce and cultivate in its place.
One thing I've really come to appreciate during the summer is how much of a difference the right bedding can make. There's nothing worse than climbing into bed after a long hot day and feeling like your sheets are trapping all that heat. That's why I've been sleeping on Cozy Earth's bamboo sheet set. Honestly, these are some of the softest sheets that I've ever used. They feel incredibly smooth, but what really stands out is how breathable they are. Instead of getting warmer throughout the night like a lot of cotton sheets do, they stay cool and comfortable, which has made a noticeable difference in my sleep. I've also been using their beach towels lately, and they have the same premium feel. They're plush, absorbent, and feel like a big upgrade over your standard beach towel. Whether you're heading to the pool, the beach, or just relaxing outside, it's the kind of towel that makes summer feel a little more luxurious. And one thing I always like to see is when a company really stands behind its products. Cozy Earth offers a 10-year warranty plus 100 nights of hassle-free returns on their bedding, so you can try it out completely risk-free. Made from viscose from bamboo, breathable, soft, and built for summer. Head to CozyEarth.com and use my code Justin for an exclusive 20% off. That's code Justin for an exclusive 20% off. And if you see a post-purchase survey, mention that you heard about Cozy Earth right here. Yeah, and when you take sex off the table for a little while, oftentimes the focus is on, well, let's rebuild our just general connection overall first before we go back into trying to have sex again. And that's where oftentimes sensate focus exercises might get prescribed during therapy, where you simply focus on touching each other just for your own enjoyment. And it's not for, the purposes of erotic arousal and pleasure. It's just to really build connection through touch and through intimacy. And sometimes that can be a valuable starting point, because sometimes in relationships that become sexless, there is no other touch in the relationship, because for a lot of people, sex is the primary form of touch. And so when you don't have that physical connection with your partner in any way anymore, sometimes you need to step back and say, we just need to feel comfortable together again with each other's bodies before we can really think about having sex again.
Yeah, exactly. There's this sort of all or none thing that happens with sex for a lot of partners who have a discrepancy, where the partner, particularly the lower desire partner, might start to shy away from reaching out to have affectionate touch or non-sexual touch because they don't want to give the impression that they're open to sex or turn their partner on and go sort of into an expectation that sex is going to ensue. And so they'll slowly start backing away from general touch, even if they really enjoy and like that touch. And similarly, the partner who has higher desire, I hear from them all the time in sessions like, hey, not every touch is, initiating sex. And that's not always on my mind, but without having conversations about it, it's just, we're left to these assumptions. And then we get sort of protective and just get into this like all or none stance. And that can feel like quite a jump to go from like, we don't touch at all to we're naked and touching in very vulnerable and erotic ways. So yes, sometimes the recommendation is, can we reintroduce what we call like non-demand touch, which is touch that's very clearly understood to be non-sexual for the purpose of just being able to be present with it, to focus us on the sensation of it, and to allow your bodies to just get acclimated to that again before we jump back into maybe things that feel a bit more vulnerable or harder to approach.
Yeah, I've heard that dynamic emerge before in a lot of relationships where somebody does start to shy away from their partner's touch because they've come to learn that every time their partner touches them, that it means that they want sex or that they're initiating it. And then that leads to a total absence or disappearance of touch in the relationship, which isn't good for anybody. So I think one of the lessons there is don't only touch your partner when you're interested in sex, right?
Absolutely. And it helps sometimes in these dynamics, depending on the partnership, to explicitly say that, right? Hey, I know we have this, discrepancy or this challenge with us, but I want you to know, when I come and rub your shoulders or I come give you a hug, that's not always with sex on the mind. And can we do more of that without, you getting worried, because a lot of that bracing that you'll see that physical reaction in one partner's body where they're bracing for that initiation or for it to progress. That really can lessen when there's a clear understanding that this is just about fostering the affection and the comforting part of touch and not building into erotic touch. So the more explicit we can be about that is often helpful.
Now, I would imagine something too that often comes up in these conversations is that when you have a desire discrepancy, it's not just about how much sex people are having. It's often also about the type or kinds of sex that they're having, right? So partners in relationships might have very different erotic interests or turn-ons or ideas about what makes sex satisfying. So how do couples begin figuring out what each person is actually looking for when it comes to sex? How can that help in terms of dealing with one of these desire discrepancies?
Yeah, it's a great point, because it could be about the frequency, which I think is the most cited sort of discrepancy factor or variable. But it can also be about the type of sex, some of the mechanics or techniques around it. And it can also be about the actual experience of it. So some people are, turning to sex to have this more sort of transcendent, almost spiritual connection. They're leaving the world behind. They're getting into almost like a flow state, and they're wanting their partner to join them in that experience. And so if one person is just kind of mechanically going through motions and like, hey, TikTok, it's time for bed, and the other person is looking to enter this sort of different headspace, that can also be a discrepancy. And what can be so frustrating for couples is that more sex or just going through the motions with sex won't always satisfy the actual desire that was there in the first place, right? So certainly, if frequency is the only metric, sure, we can, just have more sex. But if you're looking to have a specific type of experience or to go to a certain place with sex, it can often leave the person who's desiring that feeling unsatisfied, even though sex occurred. And that's where it's a really challenging feedback loop, because the lower desire partner is like, we just had sex. And the higher desire partner is like, we did, but it didn't actually get to the thing that I was really looking for. And so now I want to go back and pursue it more.
Such an important point. And, when it comes to sexless relationships, oftentimes the sex disappears because the sex that the couples were having, it was just bad and people's needs weren't being met. And when you're having sex that's not really worth having, it's normal to not want that, right? And so part of this discussion of, how do we bring sex back into the relationship, it's not just about having sex for the sake of having sex. It's making sure that you're cultivating sexual experiences that are really truly meeting everybody's needs within that relationship. And when you're having really great sex, that often makes you want it more, right? And so when it comes to, reinvigorating sexual desire, starting with looking at and attending to the quality of the sex that you're having can be a really important and useful starting point.
So we're looking at things like what motivates you to have sex, right? Like, what are the reasons that you have sex or you've been having sex? And what you'll see in this dynamic is often one person is having sex because they feel like they have to. And that over time is not a great motivator, or at least, it's fine to have sex to please a partner sometimes, when that's the predominant or the default or like the only reason that you're coming to the table for sex. It doesn't take long for that to really not work over time. It tends to cause problems. So fine to have sex sometimes because you're like, I want to show up for my partner. But it's also really important to have your own motivation for sex. Otherwise, it continues to be this thing where you feel like you're just in service of somebody else.
And that gets to this whole idea of approach versus avoidance motivations for sex. And, you have to have your own approach goals, like the positive reasons for why you want to have sex and what you're going to get out of it. If you're only ever having sex for avoidance reasons, because you're trying to avoid a negative outcome, because you don't want your partner to be mad at you or leave you or something else like that, that just does not work over time. And it's very corrosive to sexual and relationship satisfaction. So, part of the discussion here too isn't just about looking at your sex life, it's also about looking at your overall life more broadly, right? Because for couples who are living busy lives with kids and demanding careers and have caregiving and other responsibilities, it might just not be realistic to think that you're going to have a lot of spontaneous desire or spontaneous opportunities for sex, right? Now, I know that some people cringe at the idea of scheduling sex because it sounds unromantic, but can scheduling sex actually work? And if so, how do you make scheduled intimacy feel exciting instead of obligatory?
Great question. And a very controversial one, I think, because you'll get very different answers depending on who you ask. I'll caveat and say, for those where scheduling sex is already working, do what works for you, right? So if it's working for you, I'm not going to say that that doesn't work for some people. Those are just not the people I see because it's working for them, and that's great. So if scheduling sex works, great, do it. For the other folks where they've tried scheduling sex and that hasn't worked, there's a couple of reasons why. And for the partner who has either less internal motivation for sex, more responsive desire, or is just the lower desire partner in the partnership, what ends up happening, unfortunately, is they start to build sort of negative anticipation leading up to the time that they've scheduled. And so one person is usually like, it's, sex day. I'm so excited. And I'm like building positive anticipation. Another person is building some negative anticipation, even so far as to use words like dread, which is a pretty like substantial, descriptor of what it's like for them. And so to your point, everybody hates this idea of scheduling it. Everybody wants it to be natural and to just happen like it did at the beginning. And most of our lives work on a schedule and we are busy. And so sometimes we have to work with what makes the most sense. So there's an important distinction that I make here, which is scheduling intimacy versus scheduling sex. Now, when people schedule sex, they have a very particular idea of what that means and what that will entail. And they're usually thinking of a very linear sexual script that starts with some version of kissing and fondling, introducing genitals, penetration, and orgasms. And that is really exciting for some people and not everybody's favorite thing. Or sometimes you want to do it that way, and other times you don't have the time, energy, or interest in that particular script. So I think scheduling or prioritizing or whatever language you want to use is important, but keeping the interaction more flexible and open-ended, which is why I brought into intimacy, because that can mean a lot of different things. And it means that we're taking context into account, right? So the kind of intimacy that you decide to have together on a Wednesday night after work might be different than what it looks like when you're on vacation, might be different than what it looks like on a weekend morning, might be different than when the kids are at, grandma and grandpa's house, so you have different contexts that may create different experiences, different wants, different things are going to be more conducive to different times. And so scheduling time, really great, keeping it really flexible and open-ended. And the way this works best is when sometimes it does lead to, some sort of sexual contact that feels really nice. And sometimes it doesn't lead to explicitly sexual contact. And that feels really nice. And where people get really stuck is if they get stuck in that rigidity again, right? Like we've had 3 dates that didn't lead to sex. Now we have a problem and hurt feelings and people are getting really bunched up about it. Or vice versa. We're having these, flexible dates, but really we're just scheduling sex and it keeps just being about sex and it's not really holding to the idea. So I call those intimacy dates. And we talk about that in a book I co-authored. And I think it's a great way for couples to prioritize the connection while also keeping it flexible.
Yeah. And I think flexibility is really key here. And I think it also means being flexible with regard to when it actually happens, right? So when you put it on the calendar as 10 p.m. Friday night, at this very specific time, sometimes that's a little bit limiting because life happens, right? Maybe you had a really terrible day that day. And the idea of having sex is just, it's going to become one more thing that you have to do that you don't really want to do. And so maybe instead of saying Friday at 10 p.m., we're going to say, we're going to have an intimacy date this weekend. And we're going to figure out when it's going to work best for us, when we're both in the right headspace to be present and to enjoy it. Because when you force scheduled sex, I don't think that often works out very well. And it just reinforces this idea that you're not really very connected sexually. And then that's going to make you want it less. And so having that just sort of flexibility that like life's going to happen. And also sometimes we might need to reschedule it because maybe you got a call with some terrible bad news and it's like, now you can't focus on sex. You don't want to fall in the pattern of where you're constantly rescheduling every intimacy date, but having some flexibility built in where you realize sometimes we're just going to need to postpone it, or we're going to move it to a different time during the weekend when we can both be present and show up.
Yeah, exactly. I call it flexible consistency, if that makes sense, because you want the flexibility to say, I don't feel well. Something happened. It's just not conducive. We have people in town, whatever. So I've never met a couple that can 100% keep to a date for the rest of their lives, every Friday at 10. Stuff comes up. But the consistency of knowing that the majority of the time we make space for this on the weekend or within, a couple days of that. And that really builds the trust that this is something that's important to us. It happens most of the time. And if it's not Friday night, it'll be sometime on the weekend or, weeks and weeks aren't going by with kicking the can down the road. And so that's how we build trust, I think, on both sides of the equation, is that the flexibility is more prevalent when we know that we can be pretty consistent, but also have the flexibility as well.
What are your favorite books, exercises, or resources for couples who have a sexual desire discrepancy or they're in a sexless relationship and they want to start working on this today?
Well, is it shameless plug to a book that I co-authored with Dr. Jennifer Wenzel, which is all about desire discrepancy. And I say that because we just put a lot of clinical information and therapeutic information in there that I think can be really helpful. I love Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski. It goes over a lot more about responsive desire and pleasure and just a lot of parts, especially around sex ed, that most of us didn't get. So that's at this point, I consider it a classic. I don't know if it's old enough to be a classic, but it's a classic. Sex Talks by Vanessa Marin is a good one for giving some foundation to how to talk about sex or how to enter some of these conversations. So that can also be a really helpful one. And, I know there's your book too, which is great about talking, if you want to talk more about fantasies and just normalizing that conversation and kind of knowing what people are thinking behind the scenes. So there's some really great literature out there that can really be helpful.
All great recommendations. And I've actually had all of those authors on my show before. Vanessa Marin was here. Emily Nagoski was here. So for folks who want to learn more from those individuals, you can just go search in the archive and bring them up. One last question for you, Lauren. For couples who might be feeling discouraged because maybe they've been struggling with this for years, what message do you want them to hear about this?
I want people to know that this is a largely workable scenario. It is the most common thing in the area of sex and couples to have a discrepancy or differences either some of the time or more perpetually. And usually there's just a lot that we can do to make this feel better. Again, our aim is usually around decreasing distress. That can look like different things to different couples. But, at least in my experience, it's rare to see this be so fundamentally different that couples have to break up over it.
Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Lauren. I really appreciate having you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your book?
Sure. You can find me on my website, drlaurenfogel.com. I'm also on social media at Dr. Lauren Fogel Mercy.
And your book is called?
Desire, an inclusive guide to navigating libido differences in relationships, with my amazing co-author, Dr. Jennifer Wenzel.
Great. And I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thanks again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thanks for having me back.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.